straight face.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
He knew.
He knew that, and I should have known. I should have known better because there's a town a little bit south.
Okay.
That was Meadows,
Oh.
as far as I considered, but it was Meadows. It was Meadows.
Good morning.
Yeah.
We're going to begin chapter 42 today. And I think it's a very appropriate place to start for two reasons. First of all, Jay and Carol will have to forgive me for repeating some things that we spoke about yesterday in class. And number two, this past Sunday was the 3rd of Tammuz, the 31st anniversary of the passing of the Rebbe. And today's Tanya very much connects with what there isn't a good word for it, but what one of the objectives of a Rebbe and connecting to a Rebbe is. So we learned last week, or in the last chapter, that we need wings. The wings are love and fear. And you would think that the first wing to acquire is love. And yet we know that there is a lower level love, a basic love of obedience, a basic fear that is really obedience. And we had spent a whole chapter trying to figure out, let's say I have the obedience without the feeling. Is it still considered fear, even though I don't actually experience fear? And the answer is yes, as long as the result of said fear is there, it's considered fear. So there's a lower level of fear that every person can acquire, needs to acquire. But how do we actually acquire that? How do we get that? Okay. So, and this is where I'm going to regurgitate something I used yesterday in class. There is, as part of Moses' farewell address that took approximately 5 weeks before his death, which is the book of Deuteronomy. That's Moses' last will and testament, his farewell address to the Jewish people. During that period, actually, the day that he passed, or maybe the day before, he tells the Jewish people, and now Israel, what is God asking of you? Only to fear him. In other words, after all is said and done, 40 years of studying Torah, 613 commandments, the bottom line, what does God want from you? He wants you to fear him. Okay, if you read that verse, you think, okay, this is something accessible, easy. And then you go home after learning the verse and you think to yourself, okay, now I gotta get myself to fear God. Try as I may, I'm not creating that. So the Talmud quotes this verse and says, is fear such a small thing? That Moses says, what is God asking of you already? Only to fear him. Is it so small? Literally, the translation of the Talmud of the Aramaic words is milsa zutrasi. Zutrasi is like small, not inconsequential, but small and that easy. So the Gemara says, yes, for Moses, it's small. That's the Gemara. How do we understand this Gemara? So one way of understanding it is that Moses was speaking to himself. In other words, the Gemara is saying that for Moses, it's easy. In other words, Moses was talking to himself. The problem with that is, the verse says Moses is speaking to the Jewish people, and he says, Va'ata, now Yisrael, he's speaking to all of Israel, not to Moshe. Mm-hmm. So obviously that can't be the reason. So what does the Gemara say for Moses? It's easy. Moses isn't talking to Moses. Moses is talking to the Jews. So one possible answer is Moses assumed that all the Jews were like him. In other words, he was talking to them on his level. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. What part of that makes sense?
Well, that's the only level he knows. In other words, he's not lived with what their belief is and stuff. he has been talking to God, and therefore he's at a level that's totally different. He's more almost at the level of an angel.
Okay. What you're saying is true. There's a problem with that. What's the problem with that? There's a twofold problem. The first problem is these words are part of the Torah. In other words, these words were dictated by, this is God inspired, either inspiring. Deuteronomy question whether God dictated the words or the inspiration for words. Either way, at the end of the day, it was included in the Torah. These are divinely inspired words. Is it possible to say that God writes in the Torah, now Israel, as if Moses is talking to Israel, but really he's not? He's really talking to himself? Doesn't sound appropriate. In other words, now we're assuming that God knows that Moses doesn't understand the Jewish people, and he was only speaking on his level based on the way you understood it. Why would God include it in the Torah in that way? That's perhaps, but there's a more pragmatic problem or practical problem with that approach, and that is, what's Moses' title? What's his job description for 40 years? He's a leader. He leads the Jewish people. It seems very far-fetched to assume Moses doesn't understand the Jewish people. I'll give you some examples. Although there is a story about Moses, but there's a more famous medrash, a story about David, that King David was, before he was appointed as king, he was a shepherd for his father, and his genius in shepherding his father's sheep or flock was that when he would get to a new grazing area, he would divide the sheep. He would lock them out. He would enclose them so they couldn't just graze. He would first let out the baby sheep so that they could eat the soft, fresh grass, top layer of grass. Then he would let out the old sheep who could do a better job chewing and digesting the middle layer, and then once they were finished, he'd let out the strong adult, the middle-aged sheep, or the strong sheep. And God saw that, the Medrash says, God said, this is the type of shepherd I want for my people. For Moses was the same type of story, or a different similar story where he ran after the sheep to the burning bush. Although the way we know the story, it's almost as if the sheep was leading him to the burning bush. But the way the Medrash explains it is that the burning bush was a result of him chasing one sheep. You have a herd of thousands of sheep and one sheep goes missing. Why are you abandoning everyone to go look for one sheep that went away? Moses cared about even that one sheep. God decided, this is the guy I want. So God appeared to him in a bush and said, I want you to. God could have appeared to Aaron in Egypt. Well, why did he have to appear to Moses to travel back to Egypt? Just appear to Aaron, let Aaron take the Jews out. But no, Moses proved his ability to relate to each individual, to care about the needs, and throughout the desert, throughout the journey through the desert, we find this. And then throughout history, the concept of a Jewish leader, even in halacha, the Sanhedrin, before they enact a new law, it says they have to overthink their new enactment to see whether a majority of the Jews will be able to handle this new enactment. So much so that there were certain enactments that the Sanhedrin made that automatically dissolved because a majority of Jews couldn't take it. And so they didn't need a later Sanhedrin to come and say, no, the previous law is gone. It just never took hold. So this concept that a leader, according to the Torah, according to Judaism, has to be someone that knows how to relate to the individual. So to say that Moses was talking at the end of 40 years, and the very last words he says comes across as if he's aloof and doesn't understand the people, and really like two different worlds, it seems a little hard to accept that. Yeah?
Wasn't there another reason that God picked Moses? Because it wasn't the first time, but when he killed that Egyptian, people think he was looking around to make sure nobody was watching him, but he was looking around to see if anybody else was going to help.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
So therefore, that's why he did it, because nobody else was going to.
you're saying there was another incident in which God saw that Moses actually cared about his fellow Jews.
Right,
Okay, it all brings the same, yeah, but that happened many years earlier.
right.
So this was a more close, but yeah, there's plenty of stories about Moses where we see this.
The, newsletter that you sent
Yeah,
last week that we finally read.
yeah,
I read the message, and that was talking specifically about leadership.
yeah.
And it seemed to me that it was trying to emphasize the significance of being a leader is entirely different than just telling people what to do. It's giving them the tools to do what God wants us to do.
In other words, they have to recognize the place in which their students or followers are at and recognize that what might seem to me to be an obvious plan of action might not be obvious to those I'm influencing, and therefore, besides telling instructions of what to do, giving them the tools of how to do it, because it may not come as easy to them as to me. So to say here that Moses is talking to the Jewish people saying this is the easiest thing to do, but he was talking about himself and not even entertaining the fact that they may not be it may not be as easy for them, seems to be a little difficult. Let's see this question in the Alter Rebbe's words in the beginning of chapter 42. In the light of what has already been said on the subject of the lower level of fear, as summarized above, in other words, chapter 41, that there's a lower level of fear, a basic fear that every Jew needs to access, which is the foundation of the observance of all commandments. One will clearly understand the Talmudic comment on the verse. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only that you fear the Lord your God. This is the verse. So what is the comment of the Gemara? The Gemara asks, is fear then such a small thing that the verse seems to belittle, the Moses seems to belittle its significance? So answers the Gemara, yes. In the case of Moses, it is a small thing, and so forth. That's the conversation in the Gemara. So the Alter Rebbe right away asks the question, at first glance, the answer of the Gemara is incomprehensible. For the verse asks, what does he require of you? In other words, Moses is talking to you, not to me, not to himself. In other words, what does God require of every Jew? For the majority of Jews, fear of God is certainly no mean accomplishment. What then is the point of answering that for Moses it is a simple thing? Yeah? So this is the Alter Rebbe's question on the Gemara. By the way, just as a side note, one of the older Hasidim once came out of a private audience with the Rebbe, and he seemed very overly excited, not jumping out of excitement, overly rattled. He was asked what happened, so he said the Rebbe told him that it was probably he was the spiritual dean, so to speak, of the yeshiva in France, the Chabad yeshiva in France. He was a tough, harsh cookie. He dealt with with what we would call the old country style, and here was some of the boys came from Russia, and a lot of them were, American or Western kids that went there to learn and weren't accustomed to my uncle, my father's older sister. Her husband told me that he went in the 70s to early 70s to learn in yeshiva over there, and when he came back, he was in the hospital for a while. His stomach, just when the bread came in to the kitchen, he would go in, he'd cut all the bread into little pieces, let it sit out overnight, and then feed it to the boys, because he came from Russia, he came from the hungers. You didn't eat fresh bread, you ate hard bread. So you're going to feed the boys fresh bread, they're going to become what they would call American chocolatnica, chocolate, that melt with a little extra sun. So he had to toughen them up. So when you eat for a year, that style, his stomach couldn't handle it, and he was literally anyhow. That's beside the point. So, but what happened? He was talking to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe probably speaking about the yeshiva. The Rebbe told him that anytime he comes out with a new campaign, before he launches the campaign, he thinks about and makes sure that a majority of his Hasidim would be able to handle it. That what the halacha is about the Sanhedrin. So he came out all rattled. He's like, can you imagine how much the Rebbe is not giving us because he doesn't think that most of us would be able to handle it? Can you imagine how much we're not getting because of anyhow? So we suggested the answer yesterday, but today we'll elaborate a little more on it because the Alter Rebbe doesn't tell you. This is the source of the answer we gave yesterday. Is that every Jew has a spark of Moses within them. This spark is known as faith, but more than that, it's in Hasidic terminology, it's known as das. You've heard of das before, right? Chachma, Bina, das, Chabad. The D of Chabad is das. So these are three intellectual tools that the soul has, that God has. Chachma and Bina, wisdom and understanding, or knowledge and understanding. And das is knowing. For Moses, that is easy. Because in order to create fear, we need intellect. For Moses, it's easy. Now, if it would demand regular intellect, Chachma and Bina, it would be easy for each of us. But because it demands das, as we'll see, this is something that's more difficult for a person to access. But because Moses infuses das, and each Jew has a spark of Moses within him, so now, if we're able to access the spark of Moses, now it's easy. Because now we're in touch with our Moses. Okay, let's understand this a little more. The Alter Rebbe is going to bring down the concept of 7 shepherds. You ever heard of the 7 shepherds?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so it's not so clear who the 7 shepherds are, but primarily, yes, the 7 guests that visit the sukkah, the 7 ushpizin, are generally known as the 7 shepherds of the Jewish people. They are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, Aaron, David, and Joseph.
The order sometimes changes.
Hmm?
The order sometimes.
Joseph and David, yes. But Joseph definitely comes after Moses and Aaron for some reason. Okay. What distinguishes these 7 greats out of all the other great tzaddikim that lived, that they are shepherds?
A lot of them had shepherds as a profession.
Okay. Yeah, not all of them though.
No, but I said.
Yeah. Yeah, but so why are all of them called shepherds, and why are all of the other great tzaddikim that were shepherds not called shepherds?
Okay, let's take a look. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all of those were shepherds. Moses obviously was a shepherd. Aaron led the Jewish people as being the Kohen Gadol, so he was.
I know, but but then every leader is the leader of a flock.
Well, yeah.
What I'm saying is, Joshua was also led the Jewish people. He's not one of the 7 shepherds. We jump to David. Samuel also led the Jewish people. He wasn't one of the... In other words, it's not about greatness. It's not about hierarchy of levels. It's a certain characteristic that leads to these 7 being called shepherds. So one of the explanations that's given is that these 7 exemplified certain character traits, namely the 7 midot, right? And they didn't just provide that element for their time, but for all time. In other words, when we get a boost of chesed, of kindness today, it's because we have an inheritance from Abraham. Abraham is sort of giving us that boost today. So he is a shepherd of chesed, right? He is a shepherd because what's a shepherd? A shepherd shepherds his flock to feed them. Physical sheep need food. We don't need Moses to give us food, technically. We need him to give us something we don't have on our own, or we can't get on our own. That would be to become more in touch with our soul, with a certain part of it.
So what they're saying is that each of these 7 shepherds gives us a piece.
Yes.
We've inherited something from each one of the seven.
Exactly. So, for example, Avraham is known as chesed, as kindness. Avram was extreme kindness, so much so that Sodom, which God wanted to destroy, Abram wanted to somehow protect, even though they weren't deserving of protection. How do I know they weren't deserving? Because God ended up destroying them. So I know they weren't deserving, and yet Abram tried to stick up for them. Yeah. This is so part of our DNA that the Talmud says that the Jewish people have three inherent qualities. One of them is gomel chesed, like someone who does acts of kindness. And the Talmud goes so far as to say is if there's a Jew that's extreme in the opposite of acts of kindness, in other words, he's extreme in being, the term it's used is an achzer, I think, like a wicked person, then you have a reason to question his lineage, whether he actually comes from the Jewish people. Okay? So in other words, this is what's explained about the seven shepherds. So now Moses is one of these seven shepherds. The way the Zohar calls Moses is not just a shepherd, but a raya. Raya is like a roa, a shepherd. Mehemna, from the word emuna or mehemen. So 1 minute. That's not the literal or the simple meaning of emun of raya mehemna. The simple meaning would be a trustworthy shepherd. However, because the shepherd comes first, so you could translate it as a shepherd of faith. It's either a faithful shepherd or a shepherd of faith. Shepherd's faith, yeah? What's the faith that Moses shepherds the Jewish people? So the Zohar explains das. Das means Das is the key that accesses the seven midot. I'll give you a simple example. You know what? Before we elaborate, how do we know that Moshe wanted das, or Moshe exemplified das? So we know that there were times when Moses asked God, I want to know you, right? Moses said, I want to know you. What did God say? You can't know my front, I'll show you the back, right? But Moses wanted to know and employs the hodieni. He uses the terminology das. We'll soon see how it's different than Chachma and Bina, although we've already seen it in Tanya before. But it's a deeper, it's not just intellect, it's a deeper element of intellect. And this level of das, Moses gives us. If we're able to access das, that's a gift from Moses. That's Moses shepherding us. That's the spark of Moses within us. And because we have that, now fear of God becomes easy, becomes accessible.
It wasn't it that God had Moses give all the Israelites a piece of himself, a piece of his faith or whatever. That's the part of
God had him do that. That was his essence. His purpose in this world was to provide that for the Jewish people.
Okay.
In other words, it wasn't something that, was his own and God said, oh, please share it with the Jewish people. This was his essence. Just a few weeks ago, we read a story. The story was where Moses is leading the Jewish people in the desert. Yeah, his parents aren't alive anymore. But he has an older brother and an older sister. He's the baby. Now, naturally, the older siblings are going to look out for their younger sibling. One day, Miriam is talking to her sister-in-law, to Moses' wife, and he hears that it's been a while that they've been separated. They're still married, but they haven't been together. They're not physical. There's no intimacy. They're separated. And Miriam, as the mother, as the maternal, the older sister, is horrified. What's going on? So she calls her brother Aaron, says, we got to make an intervention. We have to figure out what's going on. Before Moses is involved in this conversation, God appeared suddenly to Aaron and to Miriam.
First time, right? That God appears to Aaron.
No, well, God spoke to Aaron before. God appeared suddenly to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and said, go out, all three of you, to the tent of meeting. And the three of them went out. Okay. Now, before we go further, this already was an answer to Miriam. Because what's not addressed in the verses, what's addressed in Rashi from the Medrash, is that what happened here? They assumed, why is Moses separating from his wife? Not because he doesn't like her, but because Moses speaks to God. When you speak to God, you have to be ritually pure. When someone is intimate with his spouse, they become ritually impure. You have to go to the mikveh first before you can purify yourself. So they assumed Moses is a prophet. God speaks to us too. And he never told us to separate from our wives, or from our spouses. We still live normal lives. Why does Moses can't Moses live together? And when God speaks to them, then here God appeared suddenly. This was the first clue that Moses is different, because to Aaron and Miriam, they got a warning. God wants to speak to you. And so they had time to prepare themselves. But Moses, God appeared suddenly to. This is the first time they experienced it. And at that moment, they realized maybe why Moses had to separate from his wife, because he got sudden appearances. He couldn't wait to go to the mikveh. If God's waiting for you, you don't go to the mikveh. This was a big debate, by the way, amongst Hasidim, because a Hasid, and one of the reasons Hasidim went to the mikveh every day, or even some wear like a garter, the belt we wear during prayer, wear it under on top of their tzitzis. Because imagine you get a letter from the Rebbe. You don't want to open it and read it before you go to the mikveh, before you put on a gartel. But the Rebbe wants to tell you something. How can you wait? So this is a big philosophical, should you go to the mikveh every day? And if you don't, if you receive a letter, do you open it before you go to the mikveh or after you go to the mikveh? Okay, I'm just sharing with you. But this is,
Wearing that is the same as going to the mikveh?
No, it's a separate thing, but that would be it's two separate things. Okay, so that's the first thing. God appeared suddenly to Moses. Okay, God came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent. He called out, Aaron, Miriam. So all three of them there, God says, Aaron and Miriam, I want to talk to you privately. And they both went away. He said to them privately, please listen to my words. When someone among you experiences prophecy, God will I will make myself known to him in a vision, or I will speak to him in a dream. That's how prophecy works. It doesn't work that you're walking down the street and you see God. It's in a supernatural state. It's not in the normal. It's in a dream or in a vision. But this is not the case with my servant Moshe. Among my entire household, he is trusted. It was I who told him mouth to mouth in a vision of clarity and not in riddles to separate from his wife. In other words, he didn't do it on his own. I told him to do it. He gazes at the image of God from behind. Okay, but he gets he's a different type of prophet than the rest of you, than everyone else. So why are you not afraid to speak about my servant, about Moshe? Who gave you the right to speak about it? You guys are in a whole different league. Then God became angry with them and he left. Okay, and then she has tzaras. Aaron tells Moses to pray for her. God says she'll have tzaras, but the Jewish people will wait for her. They won't travel without her. Okay. The key here is God tells Aaron and Miriam that Moses has the key to every room. So even though in the 7 shepherds, each one shepherds something specific, Moses has the key, the master key. Moses has the master key for everything. What's that? So Moses has a specific level, one of the 7 emotional attributes. But what's the master key to the emotions? Das. And that's the key Moses has, that, and if I and you have a piece of Moses, we also have that master key. Okay, let's look inside. The explanation, however, is as follows. At the bottom of 627. The explanation, however, is as follows. Each and every soul of the house of Israel comprises within it something of the quality of our teacher Moses, peace unto him, for he is one of the 7 shepherds who cause vitality and godliness to flow to the community of the souls of Israel, for which reason they are called shepherds. I'm not going to get into it, just want to point out that these words we just read, vitality and godliness, that and in the Hebrew is a vav. Because is godliness vitality? Is vitality something separate from godliness? Isn't the whole Tanya that what animates us is a divine soul? The Hasidic tradition is that the Alter Rebbe spent weeks, maybe perhaps even 6 weeks, debating whether he should put in that and. Is it 2 separate things or one and the same? Anyhow, it's beyond the scope of our class today. I'm just pointing out the specificity with which the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya. Okay, so Moses shepherds us the vitality and godliness that come to our soul. And Moses, our teacher Moses, peace unto him, comprises aspects of them all, of all 7 shepherds. And he is called the faithful shepherd in the Zohar. This means that he draws down the quality of Das to the community of Israel, that they may know and be cognizant of God, so that for them, godliness will be self-evident and experienced by every Jew. Remember the story of I said last, Rabbi Yitzchak Barditchev, that the maidservant said she says there's a God, I know there's a God. Each according to the intellectual capacity of his soul and its root above. In other words, according to the height of the source of the soul as it exists above. That's the limit to how much they could know and experience godliness. And according to the degree of its nurture from the root of the soul of our teacher Moses, peace unto him, which is rooted in the Das Elyon, in other words, the supernal Das, knowledge, of the 10 Sefirot of Atzilus, which are united with their emanator. For he and his knowledge are one. And he is the knowledge. He's the knowledge, the knower, and the known. He's the knower, the knowledge, and the faculty that knows. Okay. So there seems to have been a contradiction between the verse and the Talmud. The verse seems to say that the fear of God is applicable to every Jew. The Talmud, and that it's a small thing for every Jew. The Talmud says it's a small thing for Moses. How do we reconcile this contradiction? The reconciliation is every Jew has a piece of Moses. So now for every Jew it's small. Which part of you? The part of you that's in touch with Moses. By the way, there was, many of you are familiar, there was in the 80s, 1985, there was a tragic story in which the only grandchild of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe snuck into 770 and started stealing books and artifacts that belonged to the previous Rebbe. Anyhow, it ended up in court, in federal court. And the 2 sides were that there were plenty of documents from the previous Rebbe about his library, but there seemed to have been a contradiction. Many of them seemed to imply that the library was a personal artifact, and many of them seemed to imply that the library was of a communal, that it belonged to Agudas, the umbrella branch of the Hasidic movement. And the judge was having a hard time deciding, how do you decide such a matter? Which way is it? They said that it's a contradiction. And therefore, the only reason the previous Rebbe ever said that it was a public thing was just to help him get it out of Russia. For when it was monetarily beneficial, he did it that way. The Rebbe was appalled by how could you say about a Rebbe that he would be swayed? And there were many letters which seemed to imply the previous Rebbe was not using it for monetary or even any type of expedience, any type of benefit. And then the Rebbe's wife, the Rebbetzin, was deposed. And at the very end of the deposition, a question was asked of her. The opposing attorneys were objected to the question. They were horrified by the question, but the question was answered. And in his ruling, the judge references this statement and the Rebbe spoke about it afterwards, that this was sort of the determining factor in his decision. She was asked point blank, in your opinion, do the books belong to your father or to the Hasidim? Which isn't really a question. I don't think it's a question you're allowed to ask in a leader. In her opinion, who's she? That's not a question you can, right? You ask an expert.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, it wasn't a Jewish court. It
Correct.
was a secular.
The Rebbe wanted to go to a Jewish court. He refused to go. And because he lived in New Jersey, so he took the books over state lines, so they were able to get it into a federal court, which made it, anyhow, it made it more, at the end of the day, more favorable, although you never know which way it could have gone. Really, it should have gone.
The opinions are always disregarded.
Oh,
So this is,
so she answered. So the question was, in your opinion, do the books belong to your father or to the Hasidim? So she said, without hesitating, she said, and there's a recording of this, so you can hear it, to the Hasidim, because my father belonged to the Hasidim.
Oh.
Without thinking, that was her response. And when they showed the deposition, notice she didn't go to court. She was deposed in her home. They showed the video in court. When they showed they showed that part, everyone was able to see a change. The judge was stoic throughout the entire. It was like 5 weeks of testimony he was stoic throughout. It wasn't a jury trial. It was something changed, and we know from his relatives the impact that statement made on him. But this is what Alter Rebbe is saying in Tanya, right? That there's a piece of Moses in every single Jew, and that piece is accessible to us in a very pragmatic way. Acquiring fear of something is something you're either able to do, is easy to do or not. There's a litmus test. This isn't something that you could superimpose on someone. Either it works or it doesn't. Yeah?
I always seem to have a problem using the word fear. It's like you're afraid of God.
I know, but I think we already
We went to
settled that last
different
class, not just different levels. The point is obedience. The point is this lower level fear that we're discussing here is obedience, that you do whatever God, you fulfill the commandments. You learn Torah and you do the commandments. Whatever leads to that is what we're calling fear. Because the result of fear is obedience. If there's no fear, there's no obedience. Right? If love is what drives obedience, then you will have times when love isn't strong enough. Because you'll say, even if I don't listen, they still love me. And that's what happens, right? Even if you don't listen to your parents, assuming you're the listening type. What happens if one day you don't listen? It probably gets shoved under the rug. In other words, love isn't strong enough to make you 100% obedient. Fear has the power to make you 100% obedient. Yeah, you're right. Fear can be a very elementary thing. That's up to you. If you want to translate fear as being fearful and being scared of like a monster, fine. If that's what gets you obedient, by all means. But that's not what we're implying here. What we're implying here is, and we'll soon see how you get there, what thought process you implement to awaken fear, to get to fear, and we'll see that that's not the fear. Also, this is the lowest level of fear. We're going to learn about higher levels of fear that will come later.
talking, not Stephen, you were talking about the obedience of trusting in God and obeying.
Yeah.
And not reinterpreting it.
Adding in your own explanations. Exactly. And because the first set of spies were so spiritual, they were so spiritually elevated, the obedience was lacking. There was a lacking obedience. There was more a relationship of love. The Jewish people in the desert experienced a love relationship with God. God took them out of Egypt, even though they didn't deserve anything. God gave them the Torah. He fed them for 40 years. He clothed them. He protected them. That was a love relationship. So when push came to shove, Moses comes back 6 hours late. They build themselves a golden calf. Israel looks a little too strong. They say, we can't go. Because the obedience there wasn't a real foundation. Okay. So we know Moses. Then the same Zohar that speaks about Moses being a faithful shepherd tells us that in every generation there's a Moses. In other words, Moses is not a person. Moses is a concept. Now, the concept of Moses embodies a person, okay?
Right.
But it's not the individual Moses. So after Moses passing, the next Moses was Joshua. Okay, he had a different name, but he was Moses. Because what's Moses? Moses is the person, the soul, that provides that provides faith for the Jewish people. Yeah? Provides das for the Jewish people. Whoever does that in any specific generation is the Moses. The Zohar says Mordechai in his generation was like the Moses in his generation. In other words, who was Moses in time of Purim? He had a name as Mordechai.
So was Rebbe considered the Moses
Yeah,
of that generation?
if you ask me.
Now,
I was born-
who is now?
You asked me, the Rebbe. I was at his gravesite 31 years after his passing. There were close to 100,000 people in 90+ degree weather. People were fainting because it was so hot. And tens of thousands of people came there. To me, there's nothing more living than that. Is there another person? I don't know. But it seems to be strong enough that Chabad is alive and kicking 31 years later.
Well, it's still the same generation right now. That generation has.
Someone once asked me, my birthday, I was born on the 7th of Adar, right? And
Yeah,
that's Moses' birthday and his yahrzeit. So someone asked me, why didn't my father give me the name Moses? So I said he did. I share a name, the same name as the Rebbe.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
That was the reaction. Okay.
My mom's her side.
his birthday.
That's how we remember.
Okay,
all this.
so how does the Moses of 3,300 years ago, as well as the Moses of every generation, impact the people? There could be a number of ways. Either he teaches them Torah, or he guides them in their life, or any other right? Moses, we just learned last week, Moses provided meat for the people. The people wanted food, it had to come through Moses. It wasn't like they could go directly to God, it had to come through Moses. Even the physical, the material aspects of the generation come through Moses. But why do we need a Moses? Why do we need a tzaddik? Don't we have a divine soul that's a part of God? Aren't we capable of connecting to God? So the answer already we had in the Torah. The Jewish people were standing at the foot of Sinai. God started speaking to them. What did they say?
And Moses speak for us.
Yeah, he says, we can't handle this. We want to hear it from Moses. And God didn't say, oh, you losers, or you crybabies. God didn't say, God said they're right.
But didn't he hold a mountain over their head?
No. The Jewish people, right after the Ten Commandments, they said to Moshe, you speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us lest we die.
Well, they said that their souls popped out of their body.
Fine, but they preferred that their connection should go through Moses, and God agreed to them. Now, this is not a regular conduit connection, that it's something independent, like some other religions that have like a human intermediary. This is not that. This is not Moses standing in for some divine becoming God. This is Moses as a Jew. But Moses as a Jew has the soul that's more in touch with God than we do. He gives us part of that soul that we could connect to him. And through that connection, we're much closer to, we'll take the human anatomy, for example. If all Jews are one body, yeah? So the way we learned it in chapter 2 of Tanya is that the metaphor is that the father provides the drop of sperm from which every part of the child is created. The mother takes this drop and turns it into a child, into a body with limbs and everything. So the toenails and the brain both come from that drop from the brain of the father. In other words, the relationship between the toenail of the child and the father's brain, and the brain of the child and the father's brain, but the brain develops a lot before the toenails do. The brain looks a lot closer, feels a lot closer than the toenails do. But in essence, they all have the same DNA. In essence, they're all the same. Every one of us is part of the anatomy of the Jewish people. Moses is the brain. So if you want to connect to God, connecting to Moses is not an intermediary. It's not something else. It's your brain.
Okay.
When we pray to a tzaddik, we're not praying, it's not idolatry, because we're not praying to someone else to pray for me. You're praying to yourself. No, you're praying for yourself. When your toe gets injured and your toe sends a signal to your head, take me to the hospital, is your toe going to the hospital or your head's going to the hospital?
Both.
In other words, when the toe asks the head to go to the hospital, he's not praying to someone else, oh, help me. He's accessing himself. When we pray to a Rebbe, it's not that, in English, it sounds horrible. It sounds idolatrous. Praying to, because you're looking at it as someone else, as something else. It's not. Now, if the Rebbe to you is someone else, then that could be idolatry. Don't do it. But why do we make a mishaberach? Why do I pray for, someone asks me, say a prayer. What does it help me say prayer? Because we're all one unit. We're all one anatomy. If I think you're the left arm to me, then when I ask you to pray for me, I'm not asking someone else. I'm asking you. I'm asking me. I'm doing it myself. Right now, my toe is in pain. I can't pray. I'm in pain. So I'm asking my brain, which is aware of the pain of my toe, perhaps, by the way, and this is another, perhaps the Rebbe is aware of, or Moses is aware of my pain even more than I am. Who's aware of your toe's pain more, your toe or your head?
Your head.
Your head. So in other words, asking the Rebbe to pray is not just not idolatry, it's probably the smarter thing to do. Someone says, I could pray for myself. Yeah, that's like a toe taking itself to the doctor. Yeah. But again, it has to come with this approach. So here we have so let's see in Tanya here. In addition and beyond this pervasive influence to the community as a whole, in other words, that Moses provides das to the whole community, their descent in every generation sparks from the soul of our teacher Moses, peace unto him, and they clothe themselves in the body and soul of the sages of that generation, the eyes of the congregation, to impart knowledge to the people that they may know the greatness of God, das, and hence serve him with heart and soul, to give birth to fear and love. For the service of the heart, in other words, one's love and fear of God is according to das, according to one's degree of knowledge and understanding of God's greatness, as is written, know the God of your father and serve him with all your heart and with a longing soul. Only concerning the future messianic era is it written, and they shall teach no more, every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, know God. No one will have to teach anyone when Mashiach comes, for they shall all know me on their own. But for now, how do we know God? Remember, knowing here is knowing that it actually becomes part of me. It's not just I know it in my head, but I know it. Yeah, you ever went to a doctor that tried to convince you to diet or not smoke or whatever, and they themselves,
Yeah, yes.
how does that work?
Do what I say, not what I do. Yeah.
Oh, in other words, does the doctor know the risks less than you?
More.
If anything, he knows them more than you. So how is he expecting you to stop eating whatever food he wants you to stop eating if he can't get himself to stop eating it? It seems moronic for a person that can't control themselves to believe if you can't control yourself because we're assuming you know it's wrong, why aren't you doing it? Because you feel you can't control yourself. So why would I expect you to control yourself if I can't control myself? And yet, not only do those doctors do it, we do it ourselves. We expect from our kids perhaps things we don't expect from ourselves. We expect from our spouse things we don't, right? We expect our spouse to be more respectful, we expect a lot of things that we ourselves don't expect of ourselves. Where does this come from? And that's the disconnect between the mind and the heart. The mind itself, intellect, is very much a separate entity than the heart. I can learn about the dangers of certain foods for 100 years. I could dissect, I could understand it, I could lecture about it. I may be the biggest expert. But if it stays in here and it doesn't go down here, then what's going to happen the next time I see it and I crave it? I'm going to eat it. This is where Das comes in. Do you know how the Torah describes physical intimacy?
No.
Oh, it doesn't really describe it except for Adam and Eve. God creates Adam and Eve. How did the next kids come about? So the verse says, Adam knew Eve. Adam yada, dalid ayin is the root of das. Adam knew Eve and they had kids. Intellectual? What type of intellect?
Not quite.
Oh, so although das is included in the intellect, when we say Chabad, we're talking about the intellectual faculties. Das is really not intellect. It's the connector or the conduit that brings the intellect into the emotions. Das is the internalization of the intellect, the connection to the intellect or to what was intellectualized. So the first time I see a dog and I'm terrified, and then someone spends an hour with me explaining to me and proving to me the dog won't bite you. So right now, intellectually, I have zero reason to be afraid of this dog. And yet, the next time I see the dog, my heart will pound just as fast as it did last time. Perhaps why? Because it's in here. Das is after you finish studying, after you finish taking the lecture, now you go home and you meditate. You internalize, you personalize everything you've learned. Okay, so if this person was telling me that the dog isn't going to bite, let's say this dog has no teeth and it can't bite. Let's just take it to an extreme, okay? Then now I have to think, okay, the dog doesn't have teeth and won't bite. So then why am I scared? I'm scared because I'm wired to think that way. But really, you personalize it and you convince yourself, your emotions, that you have nothing to be scared of. Then the next time you see the dog, you may shudder because you've internalized the intellect, now you're calmer. You're able to settle yourself down because you know you've proven to yourself in an emotional way that there's no danger to you here. Das is, right? A man and a woman alone, they have the tools to produce a child. So why can't we just do that? And by the way, today with medicine, you could do it. In the medical world, you could do it. But naturally, how is it supposed to work? It's supposed to work when the male and female become one. When the intellect and emotion, so to speak, become one. That's Das. So you can meditate all you want about why I should fear God, how great God is, how little I am, how much God wants my little actions, and God pays attention, and therefore I better do them. But if you don't internalize it, it won't affect your actions. Most people don't spend the time to internalize the things they know. Because why should they? It takes effort. The spark of Moses within me makes it possible. Makes it easier. Let's see here. So in other words, das is the part of intellect, doesn't add new information. It just makes it relatable. It connects me to the information. Let's see. Now he's going to explain what das is. However, in the middle of 631, however, the essence of knowledge which leads one to serve God with his whole soul and heart, which is das, the essence of that is not mere knowing alone. That people should know the greatness of God from authors, right, like sages and spiritual guides and books. That's not das. That's chachma and bina, to learn the information. But the essential thing is to immerse one's own mind deeply into those things which explain the greatness of God and so in other words, read the books, learn the teachings, and now to think deeply into them and fix one's thought on God with strength and vigor of the heart and mind, until his thought shall be bound to God with a strong and mighty bond, as it is bound to a material thing, which he sees with his physical eyes and upon which he concentrates his thoughts. For it is known that das connotes union, as in the verse, and Adam yada literally knew Eve. The word yada in this verse connotes union. Thus, das entails knowing something to the point that one is completely united with it. The same is true regarding knowledge of godliness. Although when one just knows godliness, he's already fulfilling a mitzvah, still this does not suffice. It is necessary that one achieve the union of das by meditating deeply on God's greatness. Yeah, I don't know why it's separate. Let's just read one more paragraph of it. This capacity that we just explained of das, and this quality of attaching one's das to God, so that he not only understands, but also feels godliness, and so becomes wholly united with him, is present in every soul of the house of Israel, by virtue of its nurture from the soul of our teacher Moses, peace unto him. If you know, I don't know, let's say you know the computer inside and out, or you know this book, or you have a toy in your house and you know it. When you say, I know this thing, what does that mean? What are you expressing? You're probably expressing you spent a lot of time, you took it apart. Let's just assume, yeah, you took it apart, you looked at all the pieces, you figured out how it works, and now you know it inside and out, you know it backwards and forwards. Does that mean that the physical thing is not in your brain? No. And yet you say, I know it inside and out. In other words, it's part of you. It became part of you. I know it. It's mine. I've totally conquered this. It's totally mine. I got it. That's connecting spiritual, because your mind is spiritual. It's not a physical thing. I mean, it's housed in your brain, but it's not the physical meat of your brain. There's some sort of spirit that understands it. Yeah. And yet you're connecting the spiritual thing with this physical object. And yet it makes sense. It makes sense to use that terminology. So now take your brain and understand God. Obviously, not God himself, but God the way he makes himself accessible to us. Understand the way the Torah describes God. Think about it, unpack it, dissect it, understand it from all its sides. And now you become one with it. That's das. It's not just reading the manual. You wouldn't say, I know this backwards and forwards if you never actually held the toy in your hand and took it apart. If you just read the manual, that's not knowledge yet. Knowing it is when you've taken it apart, you become part of it. That's das. So it's not new knowledge. You don't learn anything new necessarily when you take it apart, but now it's alive. You see it in your eye. You see it in front of your eyes. It's not just words in a book. It's real. That's das. That's intimacy. When a husband and wife get married and become one, they become one. Not there's me and there's you. Now make me feel good. If we're truly one, now I don't care about me anymore. I've been taking care of myself my whole life. Now there's another half of me I've never taken care of yet. The rest of my life becomes about taking care of the other half. It's not 50-50. It's 100. All right, we'll pause here.
Who came up with the name Chabad?
Who came up with the name
it was
of God?
developed someplace.
So, oh, yeah, we should